Hello, historians. Welcome back to Cocktails and Cliff Notes. I'm your host, Mason, and today we are talking about the expedition that should have failed. They should not have survived, and that's the truth that history rarely opens with. Just a handful of soldiers, a few keelboats, a map that dissolved into blank paper before the ink had time to dry. They were sent to cross a continent that no American had ever crossed, through lands they did not know and did not understand, towards oceans they had never seen. And yet, they succeeded, not because they were stronger, not because they were well prepared or even really that prepared at all, but because one young Indigenous woman, barely in her 20s, carrying a child on her back, became their compass, their interpreter, and their proof of peace, and very often their reason for survival at all. This is the story of Lewis and Clark, but more importantly, this is the story of Sacagawea. Now, before we get into this little tale, I'm just going to talk for a second about my cocktail. I've just been so lazy with it. But if you do want to go ahead and just skip ahead, use the timestamps below and be on the lookout for more content involving a lot of history because I do post quite a bit throughout the week. And if you like history and you like knowing about things as much as I do, this might just be your new home. But let's go ahead and talk beverages. And then once we have something to sip on, we can get into our story. Now, I will tell you that I have not had a great couple of weeks. I was very sick. I still haven't really been to the grocery store. My birthday passed. So, really, all I have in the house is like wine that I don't really care for. I have a bottle of champagne that I don't want to open. I have like a whole bunch of liquor and nothing to mix it with. And I've just really failed miserably. I also will tell you that I tend to record like one or two of these pretty much back to back. And so I am still sipping on my Diet Dr. Pepper and I'm just going to keep it. I'm not doing anything. I don't really feel like people come here for the cocktails. And if you do, I'm so sorry. I promise I'll get back to it. We'll actually have some good cocktails at some point, but I have not felt well. And I just need to go to the grocery store and I am going to do that. But I wanted to talk first about some of this stuff because I think it's important. I like talking about history. I think it's crucial that we look back and remember it and then we look at it from multiple different angles and that we do so as often as possible. So anyway, cheers with your diet sodas in hand and let's just go ahead and dive right in. Now, we're going to begin today's little tale by starting with Mr. Meriwether Lewis. Now, he was born in 1774 near Charlottesville, Virginia. And this was in a world where plantations were all around and there was revolutionary ideals being thrown out. Oh, and then guess what? An entire whole war gets fought. And Meriwether's father, he actually ended up passing away very, very young, and his mother remarried. Now, Lewis, he grew up just roaming around in the woods, the fields. He was learning plants and animals, medicines. He had a very restless nature. He was very brilliant and he was very solitary. He was kind of the quiet kid. He didn't mind being alone out in the woods for great deals of time, just doing his thing. Now, he would later serve as Thomas Jefferson's personal secretary, and this is a role that gave him very close proximity to people of power, and it exposed his mind to a different type of ambition than he had ever seen before. But he was not at all a polished aristocrat. He was very much a frontier man with a frontier mind, and he was just living in an Eastern body. Now, that's a good overview of him. Let's move on to Mr. William Clark. Now, William Clark, he was actually born 4 years earlier in the year of 1770 in Caroline County, Virginia. Now, unlike Lewis, he was very gregarious. He was rather practical. He was very steady. He was the younger brother of George Rogers Clark, who was actually a Revolutionary War hero. And William had learned leadership very early. He was very, very adept at surveying, military command. He knew very well how to keep men alive. And he and Lewis actually met as young officers in the U.S. Army. They were opposites, but they were very compatible, kind of a my weaknesses are your strengths type of thing. Now, where Lewis burned inward, it was Clark who anchored outward. They were very, very good together and they balanced each other quite a bit. Now, let's talk about Sacagawea. Now, she was born around 1788, and her birthplace was not a colony nor a state, it was a homeland. She was of the Shoshone tribe and she was born near present day Idaho. And this was a world that was shaped by rivers, horses, and really seasonal movement. Her people knew the mountains very well. They knew the passes, they knew where survival lived. And as a child, Sacagawea, she was actually captured during a raid by a Hidatsa war party. And she was taken hundreds of miles east to villages that are close to modern day North Dakota. Now, she was separated from her family almost immediately. She was separated from her language and the name that she was given at birth as she had known it. Now, eventually, she was actually claimed by a French Canadian trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau. I'm sure I'm saying that very wrong. I always say I do the Oklahoma versions, but Toussaint Charbonneau. She was still a teenager at the time. Her life narrowed greatly, and then unexpectedly, it widened yet again because in 1803, we all know that the year of 1803, Thomas Jefferson finalized the Louisiana Purchase. Now, on paper, the land belonged to the United States, but in reality, it belonged to no one that Jefferson or anybody else had any control over. Now, at this time, Jefferson is like, we need some knowledge. We need a path to the Pacific, a catalog of the rivers. We need to know the plants, the tribes. And as a result of all of these needs, he chose Meriwether Lewis, and Lewis chose William Clark. Now, together, this very compatible little duo, they assembled the Corps of Discovery, and they would leave from St. Louis in 1804. They had boats, they had weapons, they had no guide for the continent ahead, but that all changed one winter later. So, in the winter of 1804, the expedition camped among the Hidatsa villages. Now, this is where Lewis and Clark met Sacagawea, and at this time, she was pregnant. Now, she spoke fluent Shoshone and Hidatsa, and her husband, old Toussaint Charbonneau, he spoke fluent French because that's where he grew up. So, through this long chain of translations, she actually could kind of bridge the worlds together. Now, Lewis and Clark actually hired Charbonneau as their interpreter. But what they truly got out of that particular employment opportunity is they got Sacagawea as yet another companion on this little adventure. So in February 1805, she actually gives birth to their son and they named him Jean Baptiste. Now, Clark, for some reason, called him Pomp. And weeks later, she actually took that sweet little baby boy that she just gave birth to, and she carried that little infant directly into the unknown world that lay ahead them. Now, Sacagawea, she was not just this translator, she was also used as a signal. And I hate to say used because she's a human being, but she was a signal because a war party does not travel with a woman and a child. And so they looked significantly less threatening to anybody that's saw them from a distance or that they went to approach because, it's just a mother and her baby and these two guys that are just bebopping along and nobody knows where they're headed. So let's find out. But what I'm really getting at is that her presence told tribes ahead that this was not an invading force or anybody to be afraid of. She also was very good at recognizing certain landmarks. She remembered a lot of the river bends and she named a lot of the plants. She knew basically every single inch of the territory around them. I'm sure there were times where she was like, I don't know, this doesn't look very familiar, but maybe not. I mean, maybe she was that good. I am not so good with directions, so I don't think I would have made it for very long in this particular time period. I don't think I would do very well in like any time before Apple Maps, but whatever. I do want to tell you though about the time when this expedition's boat actually capsized in a storm. And it was actually Sacagawea who, when this was happening, she was like, oh, I'll save all the important stuff. She grabbed the journals, all the instruments, all the supplies. And I will tell you that Clark very much trusted her judgment and Lewis recorded her knowledge. So when they reached the Rocky Mountains, it was Sacagawea who realized the truth. They were going to need a horse, and the horse that they were going to need at the time belonged to the Shoshone. Now, the Shoshone were her people. So even though she'd been gone for a long time, she was like, I'm sure I can work up a deal. So when the expedition finally encountered the Shoshone, the chief came forward and Sacagawea takes a step closer and she immediately recognizes this guy. And she's like, oh my God, this is my brother. Now, there were years that were stolen from their relationship. Their lives had obviously diverged greatly, and now they're reunited at the edge of a continent. And through that reunion, of course, I'm sure they were like, oh my God, is mom still crazy? Yeah, she's nuts. Stuff like that. I'm sure they were really catching up. But they did get the horses that they need. Without the horses, they were not going to be able to cross the Rockies. They were not going to be able to get where they needed to go because if they didn't cross the Rockies, they were never going to reach the Pacific. So this was a huge win and also kind of like a nice little reunion for her and her brother. Now, without Sacagawea, there is no expedition to remember because really, by the time they got to that point, and she'd already saved their lives for 500 freaking times. She was pretty impressive. But they crossed the mountains. They starved. They endured rain without end. And then they finally reached the Pacific. Now, they voted on where to build a winter camp, and Sacagawea actually got a very clear vote, which was interesting because not only was she a woman, but she was an Indigenous woman. And at this time, the world was unkind to either and especially unkind to both. But this was a very big deal. Good day for women. Go women. You get a vote in where to build the camp, Miss Ma'am. And so they did that. But the funny thing about this particular expedition, this little journey, is that they basically got there and I guess like drew some pictures. And then they were like, oh, guess what? We get to turn around and do it again. And the return journey was absolutely every bit as dangerous as the going out there. I mean, it was not good. There was a lot of illness. There were many fractures. Again, back to being real hungry. I mean, near starvation. And Sacagawea the whole time continued guiding, continued translating. And when they actually returned to St. Louis in 1806, they were all hailed as straight up heroes. I mean, everybody was so impressed. They wanted to hear their stories. They wanted to figure out what it was that they had learned and the maps and the pictures and everything like that. They were like, show me, show me. And so this was great, right? You would think. This is kind of where their paths diverge and things go. Well, I'll just tell you, Lewis, he was appointed as the governor of Louisiana Territory. And then Clark would rise to some very prominent positions in Western affairs. And then Sacagawea, she returned to obscurity. Now, after the expedition, Lewis was not doing so well. He was struggling pretty hard. He was really prone to depression. He had a little bit of an issue with alcohol and he was in some pretty severe debt. And in 1809, at a very lonely inn on the Natchez Trace, he actually passed away from gunshot wounds. And history, of course, records this as self-inflicted, and some still question that verdict, but it does seem that way. and he was only 35 years old. So that is really, really hard and upsetting. Now, Clark, he actually lived quite a bit longer. He became the governor of Missouri Territory. So they were very politically driven men. And then the interesting thing, and I'm going to use some language that I would not personally choose to use, but this is the actual title that he was under at the time. You have to remember it's early 1800s. He became the superintendent of Indian affairs, which was an extreme paradox, and it made no sense because this was a man who had relied deeply on Indigenous knowledge and survived because of Indigenous knowledge and was very, very close with a truly remarkable and impressive woman who did happen to be of Shoshone descent. And then he comes to this position where he's administering policies that displace Indigenous nations. It didn't make any sense. It kind of made me wonder if he had any bit of a soul. I will tell you, though, that he ended up passing in 1838 at 68 years old, and it's listed that he passed from natural causes. He had endured kind of a brief illness, and he ended up passing away at his son's house, and his son's name was actually Meriwether Lewis Clark, which is a good signal to his good buddy. Now, Sacagawea, she is a little bit more of a mystery. There were not as many records kept, and she lived a very quiet life after they got back home. Now, some records say that she passed away in 1812. Now, this would put her at the age of 25, and it is said that she fell ill with a putrid fever after giving birth to her daughter, Lizette. Now, others say that she actually lived for decades after, possibly even until 1884. They say that she returned west and she reunited with her people, probably her chief brother. But history just leaves that one completely open ended, which drives me nuts. So she could have been a very old woman when she passed, or she could have been quite young, and no one really, really knows. She had done something so incredibly remarkable, and I don't know if she ever realized how important or how long she would be remembered and how impressive she actually was. I think potentially that could have just been, she just knew it. It was like second nature. That's just what she did. And then she just returned to her normal life. I don't know if she understood what it meant for America or what it meant for the people that she was with personally, or that she was going to be one of the most famous women of the early 1800s. I mean, really, she was very impressive. And I do like to point out that Lewis and Clark, they mapped out all the rivers, they mapped out trails, passes, all of it. Sacagawea, she mapped out their survival. They are remembered with statues and she's remembered in names, but memory is really not the same as understanding. This expedition was not a lone triumph of American will. It was this braided story of dependence, of trust, of knowledge borrowed and rarely repaid. And again, we don't know what happened to her after this. We don't know if she had any type of relationship with any of the people in her party, or if she was properly compensated or thanked or appreciated in her lifetime. But good God, she deserves some attention today, if you ask me. She was a very impressive woman, and I love learning about her. I honestly think about it too. I'm like, it would have been cool if she would have done any of that, but the fact that she also did it with like a kid strapped to her back is insane. That's crazy. Like, the first couple months that people have kids, I feel like they're usually, like, locked in their home, and you're like, "Hey, you wanna go grab dinner?" And they're just MIA. But she said, "Here, let me just strap this human life that I just created on my back, and I will show you how to get to the Pacific and back." Anyway, if this particular story gave you a fuller version of the journey west, and if it is giving you any idea of where we are going in our discussions, please consider liking this video. Please consider subscribing and sharing it to someone who still thinks that explorers did it alone. And here's a quick toast to the rivers that carried them, the mountains that tested them, to the men who followed, and to the woman who led. And let me say, she did it without any title, without much credit. credit and without whom none of them would have ever come home. Really, cheers to Sacagawea. I will see you in the next one.